So I wanted to give Blender a shot, and how did it go for me?
He speaks a dozen languages, knows every local custom. He'll blend in.
Does anyone here speak English? Or even ancient Greek here?
Actually, it went better than that. With Blender seeing wider and wider adoption by the day, and more career opportunities developing for character animators who are proficient with this software, I think it's worth having a look at how to transition between Maya and Blender. If, like me, you are familiar with the animation workflow in Maya, and you would like to transition to Blender, but you would like to be proficient within a reasonable time frame, then this video is for you. My name is Amedeo Beretta, and the channel is Animation Pandemic. I started working as a character animator in the early 2000s. Originally I studied Maya, but then my first job was on Lightwave 3D. I also had to work in 3D Studio Max, Motion Builder and Modo. I had to transition a few times between different pieces of software. The problem with transitioning between 3D packages is that you have to get used to a new viewport, new shortcut, and a new way maybe of using regular tools like the graph editor, for instance. And all of this needs to work with your workflow. So in this tutorial we're going to see how to set Blender to operate in a way which is similar to the way we operate Maya when performing character animation, how to set up a basic character animation scene, how to set down our first keys in Blender, how to operate the timeline and the graph editor, and all of this with parallel examples from Maya so that we get to understand more or less how the two things relate to one another. Mind you, probably my solutions still need refining. Nevertheless, I managed to find myself comfortable enough animating in Blender with just a few hours. To have Blender's viewport behave like Maya's, you can download this Maya config add-on for Blender 2.8 from Form Affinity. The add-on is free, comes with a nice video tutorial on how to install it, and it will take you only a few minutes to install it. For any tool and rig I mentioned during the tutorial, you will find a link in the description. Once the add-on is installed, your viewport should behave more or less like Maya's. So left mouse button and Alt to rotate, middle mouse button and Alt to pan, and right mouse button and Alt to zoom. If you select an object in the viewport, and you press F, you will zoom just like Maya. I have mixed feelings about these tools that make Blender work like Maya because I don't know exactly what I'm missing now. I am pretty sure that like any 3D package, Blender has some things which are good and some things which are less polished. So I'm wondering if by using a script to make Blender behave like Maya, I am missing out on the good stuff of Blender. So this is something to keep in mind in my opinion. We use the tools to convert Blender to Maya, so to speak, to speed up our transition, but I still don't know if in the long run this is going to be a good decision. For a comprehensive overview of the way the interface works in Blender, I really suggest you watch Blender's own interface overview. Back to Blender, the first time you will open Blender, it will open up with a cube, which you can left mouse select now and hit delete to remove the cube from the scene. The outliner is here in the top right corner of the window, and you have this box which is part of the add-on. In Maya, the first thing you do when you want to animate a scene is set the project. Blender doesn't quite work the same way because Blender files are in fact archives. They already contain a project of their own. Right after setting a project in Maya, you normally go File and you create a reference with your rig, and you find yourself ready to animate. In Blender, first we need a rig. We're going to download this ball rig with squash and stretch for Blender 2.8. Head over to Gumroad and download the rig. You will find a link in the description of the video. First of all, we want to open the rig to see how that's built. So I'm going to go File, Open. I don't save this scene, I don't need it. And I'm going to open the rig file. The rig file is called balls for 2.80.blend. And if you look at the video of the rig had plenty of textures. So you have these 4 buttons on the top right side of the viewport. The first one is wireframe, like in Maya. The second one is shaded without textures. And then we have the textured one. And then we have the render itself. So you see the textures are there. Contrary to what would happen with a Maya file, we did not download any texture. And that's because the textures are included somehow in the Blender file. At this time, in order to link rigs into an animation scene, Blender relies heavily on collections. So let's see in the outliner how we can sort things out. We definitely don't need the ground in a rig, right? This rig was probably designed to be used within itself, not with linking. We probably don't need the camera and lights, so I will click on it with the left mouse button and delete the collection. All these box icons that you see in here are collections. They work more or less like groups in Maya, and we want to make a new collection collection to contain the whole of the rig. To make a collection, you may click on the scene collection first so that you are in the main collection, and then you click on the new collection button at the top right corner of the outliner. That creates a new collection which we are going to call My Rig, so that we know that's the collection we are playing with. And then we're going to shift select all of the collections we have left in the scene, so the ball, the obstacle, costumes, and bone and custom shapes, and we are going to left mouse drag them into My Rig. So in Maya you drag objects with the middle mouse button, in Blender you do it with the left mouse button. You see that now our rig is included in the main collection. You see there's a floor in there which I don't really need, so I can delete it. I also don't need the camera and the light, but if I select them in the outliner and hit delete, they won't go away. So I have to right click and go on delete from the menu. I don't know why is that. There you go. Now the rig is ready, and I'm going to go file again, save as, and I'm going to save this thing as rig underscore ball underscore version 2 because I already have a version 1, and now I can hit save as. Let's start an animation scene like in Maya. So from an empty scene we're going to reference this rig. So we go file, new, general, we're going to delete this cube. Now I would like to reference the rig in my new empty scene, so I'm going to go file, link, I'm going to pick rig ball 002 blend, the one file I've just saved, remember. So I click on link, and you see that unlike Maya, where at this stage I would have the rig in my file, I still need to pick a selection there. By double clicking on the file itself or by clicking on link, I now opened a whole new bunch of folders. In fact, that file is indeed an archive and itself contains the project, which is one of the key differences between Maya and Blender. Now what we are going to link in here is collections. Going to the collection folder, and you see I find all the collections plus My Rig, the one I stored just earlier on. So I'm going to click on My Rig and I'm going to click on link. If I click on this icon at the top right corner of the screen, I can go into viewport shading and I can find my textures right there. So at this stage the rig is linked. Before animating it, we need to select the collection of My Rig, then go at the top left side of the viewport onto object, click on it with the left mouse button, go down to relations and make proxy. You have to pick the collections that you want to make a proxy, and I will pick rig. There you go. The rig snaps back to the center of the grid. Now we are ready to animate. So this will be at the moment the equivalent of referencing a rig in Maya. So maybe let's build a floor. So if I hit Shift A on my keyboard, I can create objects. I can go mesh, cube, and that's my cube in there. I will hit W and I will move down the cube. I can hit R and I can scale in one direction and in another. So keys, you would expect to be able to just grab the rig and move it around, but before setting down keys, you have to select your proxy rig in the outliner, and then you go on to object mode on the top left corner of the screen and you go into pose mode. Now I can select the main controller, and I have a little bit of a problem here because in this particular rig I don't see the selection highlight, and I don't know why that is because I'm just too fresh on Blender. I will still work nevertheless. On frame 1 I will move up the sphere, and to set down a key you have to press I on your keyboard, and this menu lets you set a key on location, that is translation, I again and you set a key on rotation, and I again and you set a key on scaling. This is not very fast, although I really like the fact that this menu shows up where I need it. It feels a lot more lightweight than a hotbox in Maya, for instance. This way of setting down keys is not very efficient, so let's make it more so. When you press I on your keyboard and you load this menu, you're actually engaging in the keying sets from Blender. Keying sets can be found here on the left hand side of the dope sheet or timeline. If you click on the drop down menu, these are the keying sets. One thing that they do is they let you key specific channels of your rig. So for instance, if I set this active keying set to location, whenever I select a control and press I, you see the key on the transform channel. If I don't see this sort of channel box, I can press N on my keyboard, N like November, and that will show the channel box. The problem with these keying sets is that if you open up a new scene, these keying sets will be reset again, so you're back to scratch. Whenever you will press I, you will be left with this menu, which is, as I said, not very efficient. So to make this faster, let's remap a couple of things in here. We can go under Edit, Preferences. In here under Key Map, we can choose the shortcuts and we can type in Insert Keyframes. And you see that we have several Insert Keyframes functions, and that's because hotkeys like menus in Blender are context-based, meaning that a hotkey will work in a certain way in the viewport viewport, but as you move your cursor into another, say, section of the UI, that hotkey means something else, which is an incredibly good feature in my opinion, as well as a frightening one. So let's change this key anyway, and I will find the Insert Keyframe menu under the Pose section, and I will expand the Insert Keyframe menu, and I will delete the last part, underscore menu, so that this becomes, simply speaking, an insert command. But we need to specify for which keying set we need to insert a key. We will click on the drop down menu next to keying, and we will find lock, rot and scale. From now on, whenever I hit I will in fact set a key for location, rotation and scale, pretty much like the S key in Maya, more or less, because the S key in Maya can key custom attributes as well as translation, rotation and scale, while this solution for now is just for translation, rotation and scale. We are going to do the same for object mode, expand the Insert Keyframe menu, remove the underscore menu command there, and in keying click on the drop menu and find location, rotation and scale. I have to thank Luciano, aka the Adventures of LollypopMan on YouTube, and his very good tutorials on how to transition from Maya to Blender. So I suggest you watch them because they're really useful. Now I can close the preferences window, and if I select a control and press I, you'll see I am keying the whole thing. Not bad. This olive green color represents a key. If I move the timeline, this more saturated green represent a non-keyed attribute, which however is animated somewhere else. If you drag up this window, what we're dealing with in here is a dope sheet. It's just that you don't see it yet. You have to click on this little arrow on the left hand side of the dope sheet and the summary will open up. You can expand the summary and that's your current selection. In the dope sheet, if I want to set another key, I can press I, and you see that now if I press I in the dope sheet, I get a different menu, and this time I can key all channels at the same time. To delete a keyframe from the dope sheet, you select the keyframe you need to delete, you hit delete on your keyboard, and Blender will ask for confirmation. Do you want to delete keyframes? I guess so. There are some other attributes in there, clean keyframes and clean channels, which are essentially ways to resample the curve and reduce keyframes. So I'm going to click on delete keyframes. If I want to enable auto key, this little round button at the center of the timeline is the auto key toggle there. So I can now move down the sphere onto the floor, and you see the key is set for me. In Maya, if you have auto key set to on, like in this case, you select your object and that object has no animation on any channel. As you translate the object, there will be no key laid down. This means you're not putting down unwanted animation in the viewport. In Blender, if you have no key in the channels of your character and you translate it and auto key is on, auto key will key those channels. So you gotta be careful there because it could be very easy for you to mess things up. To improve this behavior, in my opinion, it's worth undoing my key right now and go into Edit, Preferences, Animation, enable this tick box which says Only Insert Available. If there is no curve in there, you shouldn't be putting down any keyframe. There you go. And now I close. If I grab my control and you see there is no animation anymore in here, and I move it around, auto key is not recording it. You see auto key is enabled down here in the timeline. Before really animating in Maya, if you remember, we have to do a couple of things. We normally go into the animation preferences and we check the playback speed. Are we playing the animation real time or every frame? And also B, we are going to the settings of the scene and we're going to see if you're running at 24 frames per second or whatever frame rate we need really. In Blender that I know of, the frame rate is specified under this output properties icon on the right hand side of the screen, and down here you have frame start, frame end, these are rendering settings, and then the frame rate itself. And in here you can specify the scene's frame rate. That's the way I understand it anyway. The speed of the playback instead is to be found in the dope sheet. So if you click on the drop down menu named Playback on the left hand side of the dope sheet, you will find that there's an attribute at the top called no sync. No sync is the equivalent of playing every frame in Maya, and then you have AV sync, which is the equivalent of real-time playback in Maya. We're going to set our sync rate to AV sync so that we will know for sure that Blender will try to play this animation in real time. Blender default hotkey to playback the animation was spacebar. However, with these new tools that we installed, spacebar opens up some sort of hotbox. I have animated for a couple of hours in Blender with the spacebar set as a playback toggle. And to be honest, I didn't mind it at all. In fact, when the script changed the hotkeys to Maya, I was a bit annoyed because I already got used to the spacebar button. You can set the playback button to any button you want. To change a hotkey again, I can go under Edit, Preferences, Key Map, I will type in play, go under play animation, click on the hotkey allocation and type in whatever hotkey you want. I use Alt-V Maya, but it doesn't really matter in here. The hotkeys are immediately stored, so be careful with that kind of stuff, because you don't need to confirm to save a hotkey there. The moment you assign it, it's assigned. So it's a bit dangerous, I think. In Maya, to jump between keyframes, you hit comma and period by default. And to go frame by frame, you hit Alt comma and Alt period. In Blender, you hit up and down arrows to skip between keyframes and left and right arrow to go between frames. To duplicate a key in Blender, you just need to select it in the dope sheet, hit Ctrl C on your keyboard, go to the destination time, hit Ctrl V, and so forth. So we can just copy and paste with Ctrl C and Ctrl V. To drag keys in the dope sheet, you just use the left mouse button. I'm going to very quickly jot down a basic bouncy ball animation there. However, you see, the interpolation is not what we want. So, Graph Editor in Blender. To switch between Dope Sheet and Graph Editor in Blender, you just hit Ctrl Tab on your keyboard. Unfortunately, the F button doesn't work in the Graph Editor because probably the tool to convert Blender to Maya wasn't made by Animators, so they didn't think about the Graph Editor. You can remap the button, so you can still use F in there if you want, but you can also hit Home on your keyboard to frame all curves. I think, to be honest, Home to frame all keys is a bit too far away from any other key on the keyboard. Now, of course, if you drag the top side of the UI of the dope sheet, you can make it bigger. In Maya, if you want to zoom in the Graph Editor, you just use Alt and right mouse button. If you want to scale the Graph Editor non-proportionally, you use Alt, Shift and right mouse button vertically and horizontally. In Blender, you can hold down the Control key on your keyboard and the middle mouse button. You will be able to zoom one way or the other. And then you can press the button Home to reframe your curves. To edit tangents in Blender, you select the key and then you just drag with the left mouse button your tangent there. You see, tangents are weighted by default in Blender. You can expand a control in the Graph Editor and you can click on the channel name to see the curve. You gotta be careful. If you drag a selection like this one, you will select even curves which were grayed out. If you want to see the curve in solo without the other curves, you click on the channel name and you hit Shift H on your keyboard. That hides any other curve. Now, to break the tangents, you just select the keys you want to break the tangents for. You hit V like Victor on your keyboard and here you can change the tangent type. Free is the equivalent of breaking tangents in Maya, that we can operate all tangents together if all keys are selected. You can also set the tangents to linear. If you select, say, these keys in here and press V, you can go to vector, and that's the equivalent of setting them to linear. You can still grab and tweak them without having to change the tangent type. Let's say that we need to fix this overshooting curve. I select the keys, I hit period on the numpad, and that frames the currently selected keys. Again, I think this key is way too far from the other keys and you want to remap that. Then I can grab my keys, left mouse button select, left mouse button drag, press play, and we have our animation there. If we need to do retime, we can hit Ctrl Tab, go back to the dope sheet. For instance, in here, maybe I could fall down a bit faster and bounce back a bit faster as well. If you need to retime by scaling, you just need to position yourself at the time you want to use as a pivot for the scaling operation. You hit S, and that's because S used to be the scale operation in Blender. So again, you see that the script didn't really change the shortcuts for the Graph Editor, and now you can just lead the scaling action by moving the cursor on screen. You don't even need to hold down the left mouse button or even click on it. If you want to snap keys, Shift S, and you can select whatever option you prefer. I will choose nearest frame. So I have retimed it. In Maya, if you want to drag a key around in the Graph Editor, you just select it and middle mouse drag it around. If you want to constrain the translation of a key in the Graph Editor, you hold down Shift and you middle mouse drag vertically or horizontally. In Blender, you left mouse select your key, left mouse drag it around freely. If you want to constrain its translation, you left mouse select it, you drag it around and you press Y, and that will constrain, you just press it, you don't hold it down, and that will constrain the key to the vertical axis. If you were to constrain it to the horizontal axis, you drag it around, press X, and it will only move horizontally. In Maya, to make a playblast of your animation, you right click on the timeline and go playblast. In Blender, you go View in your viewport, Viewport Render Animation, and you wait, of course. To see where the animation is stored, you go into the output properties of your Blender stack on the right hand side of the screen, and into output you will find where it's stored. Which I find it a bit tricky because I would expect the animation to be stored in a project folder somewhere. Maybe there's a better way of doing it. In the same output menu, you can change the file format of your playblast to a video, and you can change the encoding settings. And now, a little bit of a neat feature of the Graph Editor in Blender. If you grab your curve and you hit T, you can change the interpolation of your curves. So you can go stepped, for instance, and all of your curves will go back to step. It's worth noticing that changing the interpolation is non-destructive. If you hit T and you go back to Bezier, you will have the same tangents you manually edited earlier on, which is a great feature to have. In Blender, you can get some animation for free, which is great. Let's say we just keep the first and the last frame of our animation and we want the ball to bounce to its rest position. You just select the two remaining keys, you hit T on your keyboard and you click on bounce under dynamic effect. That gives you a bounce animation for free. If you move this key to the left, now you can easily retime your animation, which is a great feature to have, and it really helps you if you're a generalist and your main focus is in animation, for instance. The problem with this kind of setup, in my opinion, is that you cannot really edit the bounce. That's the bounce you get and that's it. If you wanted to edit the bounce, you could select the two keys, press Alt-Shift-O on your keyboard, and the graph editor would do the equivalent of baking the animation in Maya. You see that we have very weird curves, and that's because the bounce dynamic effects is still in action. So if you press T and you go back to, I don't know, Bezier for instance, then you will get your animation there. If you want to edit this curve and get rid of some of these keys, you select all of the keys, you hit delete, go on clean curves. It seems like nothing has happened, but if you go under clean keyframes on the bottom left corner of the viewport, you can expand that window and you can, you see, resample the curve. You can also get some interesting animation for free. So for instance, let's say that we want to add some noise to this curve. What we can do is click on the channel we want to operate, press N on the keyboard like November, and the N, you see, shows and hides some panels on the right hand side. Just like in the viewport where we press N, we show and hide this sort of channel box. Now back to the modifiers of the curve in there, we can add a modifier, noise. So now when I press play, there is noise in there. In this case, this is a bit different than the bounce effect we have achieved earlier on, because in this case we can actually change attributes. So this is quite useful. You can disable a modifier to evaluate the animation before and after, and you can also reduce its influence. I'm not sure you can key the influence. I think it would be a great feature, but I'm not sure that's doable. And then you can remove them by clicking on the X. Modifiers can be as simple as the regular cycle we know from Maya. So in Maya, to make an animation cycle, you would just go under View, Infinity to show infinity curve. Then select any key and then you go Curve, Post Infinity or Pre-Infinity. In Blender, you can add a cycle modifier, and in here you can perform the same operation. Blender comes with multiple layouts. There is a layout section, but there is also an animation section, which comes with a default viewport in which on one side you have the camera and on the other side you have the perspective with the animation tools here at the bottom. You can also animate with the layout mode, but you see that as I switch from layout to animation, the object mode becomes pose mode, so Blender is self-setting to animate already, which is not a bad thing. As you could see, the initial transition is not so steep as far as character animation is concerned. In fact, I think the software is pretty powerful. If you have found this video useful, please like and subscribe, and let me know I'm not just rambling on my own.
Very good for blood circulation, heart problem, bone problem.